Thank you, Fritz, for this. Everybody hear me?
Yes.
For the introduction, and thank you all for your hospitality. I've been here several days now. It's been very, very nice. You had a chance to talk personally, to have a few interviews. I had several opportunities to guide the discussion away from what Kerry is doing into more relevant issues of what is actually happening in Palestine, and that's been very nice as well. I always like to begin my talk by asking people a couple of questions. So I'll ask you, first of all, how many people here are actually from Palestine or Israel? Can I see a show of hands? Okay, thank you. Now, how many people here visited? How many people here have actually been there? Oh, okay. Okay, so you know something about the thing. Is there anybody who can't find it on a map? Everybody knows? Let me tell you something. When you look at a map, it's very hard to find. When I speak in front of high school students, sometimes I always show them a map and I ask them to find it. Of course, it's very hard to find. You know, the name of the country is never on the country. It's usually on Cyprus because it doesn't fit. So I always like to be sure to ask, make sure everybody knows where this place is. I gave a talk about a year ago in front of a small group of students in a school in California. And before I came to speak to them, they studied this issue very well and they prepared. And one of the things they did was they took a poll. And the question that they asked themselves was, how many of them had hope that there would be peace in their lifetime? Now these children were about 14 years old. And the poll results were astonishing. 80% of them, 80% of these 14-year-olds said that there will not be peace in their lifetime. Now, I do this poll everywhere I go now because it's interesting to see. Let me ask you, how many people here think that they will see peace in their lifetime in Israel-Palestine? Can I see a show of hands? Anybody thinks they will see peace in their lifetime? Okay. How many people think they will not see peace in their lifetime? Okay. And is there anybody who's not sure? Maybe yes, maybe no. So when I told these 14-year-olds, and this is what I tell everybody. Of course, I'm much older than they were. I'm 52. But what I told these students and what I tell people every time I give a lecture is there's absolutely no question in my mind. There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that we will see peace in our lifetime. And I wouldn't be standing and talking and writing and going from country to country and giving these lectures if I didn't have that kind of hope. Because if there's no hope, then why get up in the morning and do this? There are other things that we can do if it's hopeless. And the reason I have hope is not only because I'm an optimist, but I am. So that's a part of it. But I think the way we define whether or not we have hope has to do with the information that we have at our disposal. And I think much of the information that many people have is wrong information. And I'll talk about some of that in my talk today. I think probably, if not the biggest, one of the biggest misconceptions and misunderstandings of Israel has to do with the misunderstanding of Zionism. And what is Zionism? And the idea of Zionism was that, first of all Jewish people are a nation, which is really a new idea, as opposed to being just different people who are living in different countries, but they share religion. Then they said, since all of these people are a nation, their history book is the Old Testament, it's the Bible. And suddenly they made this religious document into a history book. And they treated it like it was a history book. And then they said, well, we have a nation, and we have a history book, and now the country, of course, has to be the land of Israel. And the assumption is that these Jewish people today, this Jewish nation, we are all the descendants of the ancient Hebrews who lived in the land of Israel some 3,000 years ago. So we have myth upon myth upon myth upon myth, and at some point it's impossible to dig down and find the truth. I think when we talk about this, especially in Central Europe, there's an added layer which has to do with Jewish experience during the Holocaust, during World War II. This is an added layer to all of this. And this is a very heavy layer. Because one of the things we hear about Zionism is that it is a response to the Holocaust. It is an answer to the Holocaust. That the lessons learned by the Jewish experience under the Nazis is really Zionism. I would argue that if there's any lessons to be learned from that, is that we need to ensure that there is peace and stability and respect for human rights and respect for people's rights in general everywhere, and tolerance everywhere, as opposed to colonizing another people's country and imposing a racist, non-democratic regime upon them, which is really what Israel is all about, which is really what the Zionists have accomplished. And then we look at this, many people look at this conflict, and one of the things that they say is, well, it's really too complicated. It's really a very complicated conflict, which is why it's taken such a long time to resolve. And when people say about something like this that it's too complicated, it's basically what they're telling us is, it's too complicated for you to understand, don't try. Stay away from it. And this is a very dangerous thing, because of course if we don't try, and we don't understand it, then we're going to leave it alone. And there's absolutely no reason to leave this conflict alone, because it is not unique. We've seen conflicts similar to the Israeli-Palestinian issue resolved even in my lifetime. And I'll talk about that in just a little bit. We hear about the peace talks all the time. Peace talks, they start the peace talks, and then they fail, and they start them again, and then they fail. And when we think of peace talks, we think of two countries that are at war. But are Israel and Palestine two countries? Are these really two countries that are at war? Because if they're not, then this whole peace talks is really, this whole idea of peace talks is nothing more than a diversion. I would argue that the issue of Israel and Palestine is not an issue of two countries at war. It is an issue of two nations in one country, where one of the nations is imposing themselves on the other, is imposing a non-democratic, racist regime upon the other. And really the issue of Palestine is an issue of a struggle for freedom and democracy. So if we have an issue of a struggle for freedom and democracy, this is something we can all relate to. We've seen struggles like this in the past, and usually people who believe in human rights and so forth support these struggles. When you have a struggle for freedom and democracy, it's very difficult to ask for balance, particularly if the struggle is against a brutal militant and racist regime. I don't remember people talking about South Africa and saying, well, we need balance. Let's hear the racist side of the story. Maybe they have a point of view. Let's let them come and talk as well. It is a very clear struggle against injustice. And so if we're talking again, if we understand that it's a clear struggle against injustice, peace talks is not the issue. Boycott is the issue, divestments are the issue, sanctions are the issue, pressure is the issue, struggle, demonstrations, protests, and so forth. All the means that are being taken by the Palestinians, as a matter of fact, and have been for a very long time. So again, this whole issue, this whole idea that we need peace talks in order to solve the problem is nonsense, because this is not a problem that needs to be resolved by peace talks. This is a problem that needs to be resolved by a concerted effort to fight and end the injustice that is taking place in Palestine. Another issue that is quite often misunderstood and is the issue of the beginning of the conflict. And of course, you can spend all night talking about when the conflict began, but I think a good time, a good period to start discussing it is precisely the 29th of November, 1947. And I'm always amazed how few people know what happened on that day. In Jerusalem, there's even a street named the 29th of November. Is it November?
No, it was 17.
1947, 29th of November 1947 was the day the United Nations decided to partition Palestine. And it is one of these ridiculous attempts to take a complex issue and make it simple. Well, the Arabs want a piece of it, the Jews want a piece of it, so we give them a piece and we give them a piece and everything is fine. First of all, who are they to give anybody anything? That's the first question that you have to ask. That's number one. Number two, we have an issue where the division that was made was very strange. And you can look at the map. The bluish-greenish part was given to the Jews, and the other part was given to the Palestinian Arabs. Problem is, in 1947, there were about 500,000 Jews in Palestine. These people were the generation of my grandparents who immigrated to Palestine, and the generation of my parents who were born there. So basically, these were immigrants and the first generation born there. There were close to 1.5 million Palestinian Arabs living in Palestine at the time. So you have to wonder, how is it that the United Nations could come up with this, where they gave the larger portion of the country, again, who are they to give, but they gave the larger portion of the country to the smaller community, to really a much smaller community of basically immigrants. And they allotted the smaller portion of the country to the much larger community to who lived there, whose country this actually was. And who in their right mind thought that this was going to work, I don't know. Of course, it didn't work. This didn't last one day. And what happened the next day is a source for much of the conflict. It's probably one of the pillars of the conflict. Because from that day, from that particular day, what happened the next day, we have two stories, two histories that are completely opposite. We've got the Zionist story and we've got the Palestinian story. And they don't differ in details, they don't differ in nuance. They are diametrically opposed. We have two histories that are completely the opposite. And the problem with that is that when you have two histories that are completely opposite, only one of them can be true. If you have an argument over details or nuance, then perhaps there might be some truth in both of them. But when you have a story or two histories that are completely opposite, then there is no balance. There is no way to make them both right, which is often what people in the West want to do. They want to find some kind of a balance. So the story that I grew up with, and the story that is generally accepted in the West, is that after the United Nations partitioned Palestine, and we, the Zionists, we, the Jews, accepted the partition. Of course, we deserved the whole country because it's ours. But we were generous and we accepted only the portion of it. Still, the Arabs began a massive attack in order to kill and destroy the Jewish community in Palestine, and to destroy this new state that was just recognized. And fortunately, because the Jewish community was smarter and more advanced and quicker on their feet and so forth, they were able to defeat the Arabs, conquer the land, and after this war that lasted about 12 months, after it lasted about a year, once again the Jewish state was established in the land of Israel. After 2,000 years in exile, finally Jews were back in their homeland. This is a story that is so incredible and so heroic, it's almost biblical. You would think it came right out of the Bible. It is so heroic, it's so romantic. In my case, it's even more so because my father fought in the Zionist militia. So it's even more heroic. And it's sometimes hard to describe just how much we as Israelis identify with that story. That story is a big part of what it means to be an Israeli. Because once again, we are the David that defeated Goliath. We are the Maccabees that defeated the great empires. And now, once again, here we are, and we defeated the Arabs. And this image of we, the few, defeating the many is, of course, very romantic. So this is what it means, which is why it's such a hard issue to bring this up when we talk when we talk about this in front of Israelis. And of course, I am Israeli. And then we try to take a look at the story and to look at the details and to try to break it up a little bit. So the two communities who existed in Palestine at the time were both expecting to become states. Were both hoping to be recognized states. And they began to develop institutions of state. But there was one thing that the Zionist community in Palestine, the Jewish community in Palestine, invested in heavily, and the Palestinians did not. And it's very simple. It's an armed militia, a fighting force. By 1947, the Zionist militia numbered close to 40,000 well-trained armed men. Like I said, my father was an officer in that militia. There was no equivalent on the Palestinian side. So if there was no equivalent on the Palestinian side, in fact, to this day, there's never been a Palestinian army. But if there was no equivalent on the Palestinian side, then who are these Arabs that attacked the Jews in 1947? We know other Arab armies intervened in Palestine later on, 6-7 months later. But at that time, who are these Arabs that attacked, and what did they attack with? And then we find, well, it wasn't actually the Arabs that attacked, it was the other way around. As soon as the United Nations accepted this resolution, the Zionist militia began a massive campaign with the intention of completing the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. It was a campaign of 12 months of terrorizing the civilian population by the Zionist armed militia. It was nothing more than a terror attack intended to complete the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. And within 12 months, they were able to destroy hundreds and hundreds of cities and towns, destroy them, flatten them to the ground. They were able to force into exile close to somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million Palestinians. And they were able to conquer 80%, almost 80% of the country. So perhaps the story is not so romantic anymore, it's not so biblical, but at least the pieces fit the puzzle. We can understand now what took place. Now, one of the things that we hear quite a lot when we talk about this, and particularly when we talk about what actually took place in 1948, is that, well, perhaps the Zionists expelled a few Palestinians. And perhaps they burned a few villages. But really there was nothing much there. Palestine was basically primitive. Most of it was desert. The Arabs were uneducated and underdeveloped, and there was really nothing to lose. Nothing significant. Any progress that came with the Zionists. So I'd like to show this picture of Jaffa. This is a picture of the city of Jaffa before 1948. The boulevard that I highlighted actually still exists. The city of Jaffa before 1948 was a city of about 120,000 people. It had a rich business life, a rich political life. Several newspapers were printed in Jaffa. They had concert halls and movie theaters, trade unions, teachers' unions, lawyers' guilds. This was the city of Jaffa. It was a major Arab city on the coast of the Mediterranean. And in a matter of 2 weeks in 1948, this city of close to 120,000 was reduced to less than 4,000. All of them concentrated in one neighborhood with barbed wires and Israeli soldiers guarding them. And precisely on almost from the exact same angle, today sits the city of Tel Aviv. Jaffa was a major Arab city with a small Jewish community, a Jewish neighborhood. Today, of course, Tel Aviv is a major Israeli city with a rather small, neglected, deprived Palestinian community that has to suffer terrible discrimination. Now, I remember the first time I heard that Palestinians referred to what happened in 1948 as the Nakba, a catastrophe. And I remember thinking to myself, how could anybody call such a wonderful, historic, important event as the War of Independence of Israel a catastrophe? How inconsiderate. And over the years, eventually I learned. I was exposed to Palestinians and their story, and I understood why it's called a Nakba. I think what people fail to realize, though, when they talk about the Nakba, is that the Nakba did not take place in 1948. The Nakba, the catastrophe of the Palestinians, is a process that began in 1948 and continues to this day. So this picture, I took this picture about a year ago in a refugee camp. We have about 4 million Palestinians living in refugee camps. I think the picture speaks for itself. No running water, no electricity, no access to medical care, no sewage, of course, no heating, no rights whatsoever. And you have to wonder, why do 4 million Palestinians have to live like this? This is no more than an hour, maybe 2 hours drive from major cities that are completely modern, completely developed, where you wouldn't dream of finding Israeli children look like this. Drive up and down the country, you will never find Israeli children living like this. Anywhere. Only Palestinian children. In it and around it. And again, this is not in sub-Saharan Africa or the mountains of Afghanistan. This is an hour, maybe an hour and a half drive, maybe less, from completely modern cities. The catastrophe that began in 1948 continues today under our watch. These Palestinian children, millions of them, have to live like this because of the complicity, or to a great degree, because of the complicity of the Western nations who support the State of Israel. So if anybody wants to claim that this is the lesson of the Holocaust, they're out of their minds. This is not the lesson of the Holocaust. The lesson of the Holocaust is that we must do everything we possibly can so that this will never happen. And if we see it happening, we must stop it. Now, the way my book goes, and there's copies of the book here for later if you want, but the way the book is structured, because my family has been so much a part of the creation of the State of Israel, it's a memoir. So there's personal stories that relate to my family, and then the story of the two nations. And so this is a picture of my mother when she was young. She was born and raised in Jerusalem. She still lives in Jerusalem. And in 1948, there's a story that she told me many, many times about something that happened to her experience in 1948. And when I say Jerusalem, the Jerusalem that she lived in, I'm not talking about the old city of Jerusalem, I'm talking about the neighborhoods that were outside of the old city, what later on became the Israeli part of Jerusalem. And there were major, very important, very beautiful, very wealthy Palestinian communities that lived in that part of the city. And my mother knew them well. Like I said, she was born and raised there. In 1948, when the Zionist forces came in, they took these neighborhoods, they forced the residents out, and these homes, very beautiful homes, and if you've been to Jerusalem, you may have seen them, some of these neighborhoods. Today, many of them are restaurants and boutiques. These homes were made available to Israeli families, and she was invited to take one of these homes. She was about 22 years old. And the way she told me the story, ever since she told it to me the very first time when I was a child, all the way till today when we talk about this, she always expresses the exact same emotion. And the way she says it is always, how could I possibly take the home of another mother? How can I possibly move into the home of another family that now has to live in exile? And then she would go on to describe something I've heard many times since, is that when the soldiers came in, the coffee was still warm on the table. And then the looting began. Because these are well-to-do homes, well-to-do families, so the furniture and the rugs. And she talks about it with a sense of shame. How could we, the Israelis, the Jews, have possibly done something so terrible? And you may have heard there's an excellent documentary about the theft of books, of rare books. Apparently the forces, the Zionist forces, had a unit of librarians that followed the forces from house to house and looked for rare books. They were so well organized that it just makes me shiver how well planned this was. Now, this is a wonderful story, and it demonstrates some moral courage, certainly, but there was something about the story that always bothered me. And I remember growing up, thinking about the story, and only actually when I was working on the book, I began to understand, to reconcile what the problem of the story was. She was contradicting the national narrative. she was poking a hole at this very perfect national narrative, the Zionist narrative, by presenting a moral dilemma. The Zionist narrative is perfect. There are no moral dilemmas. The country belongs to us because we're Jews. We agreed to accept a portion of it that was given to us as a result of the United Nations resolution, partition resolution. We were attacked. We defended ourselves, and thankfully we won. Then we asked the Arabs to stay, and they left. We asked them to stay, and they left. So if all of this is true, and there's a home that's available, and there's a family that needs a home, where's the moral dilemma? There's no moral dilemma. They left of their own free accord. They deserted. The family needs a home. What's the problem? You see, the Zionist narrative is so perfect that even when they do talk about atrocities that were committed by the Zionist forces, there's still a happy ending. I'll give you an example. The story of the massacre of the village of Dir Yassin. Dir Yassin was a village on the outskirts of Jerusalem. When the Zionist forces came, the village surrendered. The forces came in and committed a terrible massacre. Now, as Israelis in school, we learn about this, in the school books, in the history books. I think this was a terrible thing. But at the end of the story, we're told that important Zionist leaders said that, of course, this was a terrible thing. At the same time, as a result of this massacre, hundreds of thousands of Arabs left, which allowed us to create the Jewish majority. And you don't have to say this, it's understood that nothing can be more important than creating a Jewish majority in the land of Israel. So even this horrific story of a massacre ends up with a good result. And here she was poking holes at this perfectly moral and foolproof narrative. So this was the map between 1948 and 1967. Israel, had captured almost all of Palestine, with the exception of the West Bank and Gaza. And then we're told that in 1967, once again, Arab armies were preparing to attack and destroy the state of Israel, and that Israel was under an existential threat, which left the Israeli army no choice but to engage in a preemptive strike. This time, the war lasted 6 days. Arab armies were destroyed. Once again, we, the David, defeated the Goliath. We, the children of the Maccabees, and so on. The narrative continues. And, all the lands to the east, north, and south were conquered. Now, my father, along with many of the other young officers of 1948, were now the generals. And in the meeting, one of the things that I did as I worked on the book is, I went into the Israeli Army archives to learn about my father's career, and the most interesting aspect of that career, of what's available, had to do with the weeks and days leading up to the 1967 war. And when you hear the generals discussing, you know absolutely, with absolute clarity, that their intention was to cross Palestine off the map and replace it with Israel. Not a single word about a threat. Weeks and weeks of debates about the war because the Israeli cabinet was hesitant, the generals were pushing for war, and the main claim that my father makes and others in these debates is that the Arab armies are not prepared for war, particularly the Egyptian army, and therefore there is an opportunity to once again attack, destroy the Arab armies, and of course, conquer more land. They knew for certain that this war was going to be an easy war, that the Arab armies would be defeated quite easily, and that they would conquer the lands that they wanted. Taking the West Bank was not something that came up suddenly. Taking the West Bank was something that the Israeli military had wanted to do since the State of Israel was established. They were frustrated that they couldn't do it in 1948 for political reasons. So the opportunity presented itself, that's how they saw it. They attacked, and of course they were victorious. Never mind the fact that in 6 days they destroyed 3 Arab armies and conquered all this land. the losses were, the numbers of soldiers that were lost tell a story on their own. Close to 15,000 Arab soldiers were killed in 6 days. About 700 Israeli soldiers were killed in those 6 days. Now every soldier that is killed, of course, is somebody's son, so we cry for all of them. At the same time, the number here tells us something. And on that day, when the West Bank was taken and the war was over, Israel, in fact, created a single state over all of Palestine with exclusive rights for Jewish people. One of the first orders given by the Israeli army was that the water in the West Bank belongs to the state of Israel. This was done immediately. The destruction of villages and communities and towns and the forced exile of Palestinians from the West Bank was done immediately, as was the building of towns and cities and so forth for Israeli Jews only in the West Bank. Exactly what they did in 1948 in other parts of Palestine, they continue to do after 1967 in the West Bank. And in light of that, we can see that the actual claim that there could be an Israeli government, that there could be a Zionist government that would allow the Palestinians a state anywhere in the land of Israel is absolutely absurd. It's a complete misunderstanding and a complete misreading of what Israel is about and what Zionism is about. This is the land of Israel. It belongs to the Jewish people. We will deal with the Palestinians however we decide best, for us. The idea that they would be allowed their own independent state on our land is absurd. It is completely contradictory to Zionism and to Zionist ideology and what the State of Israel has done since it was established.